So I think the easiest place to start is the bag. And the bag actually has a lot of important information listed right on it. A lot of the information on the bag actually is a legal requirement, and so the information has to be present. There are a few things that have to be present on the bag that are a good place to start looking when you're choosing which food to select. So the first thing you have to include on the bag is the name of the food. This is simply what the manufacturer calls the food. The second thing that they must include on the bag is the species that we're feeding. So in our case, we're going to have either a dog food or a cat food. The third part is the ingredient list, and these are the ingredients listed by weight. The fourth requirement is the feeding guidelines. This is how much food you need to feed by weight to your pet. The fifth thing is the guaranteed analysis. These are the percentages of how much of a certain particular parameter there is in the food. So this is where you're going to see your protein, your fiber, your ash, and these are usually listed in percentages. This means that it may be a minimum or a maximum, and it's not an exact amount. Number 6 is the adequacy statement. This is often referred to as the AFCO statement. This is legally required to describe the food that's in the bag. The 7th requirement is the calorie content. This is how many calories per cup usually of the food, or per can if it's a canned diet. The last requirement is the manufacturer. This is simply who makes the food. It usually will have a phone number, an address, and sometimes an email. A product name is simply what the manufacturer calls their food. For example, if we find a food that's called Best Friend Dog Food, the name of the food is Best Friend. Dog food is the designator. It tells us which species the dog food or the food is going to be fed to. In this case, it's the dog. Where it gets tricky is where they start adding different modifiers to the food. For example, beef dinner or chicken flavor. These extra descriptive terms actually have meanings and have very important information that you may need when selecting your food. So if a food simply has one word term, for example, tuna, Best Friend cat food, tuna, then that means the food must be comprised of at least 75% tuna. Sometimes you'll see terms like dinner, entree, or platter. This particular term means you only have to have 10 to 20% of that particular descriptive term. So if it says tuna dinner, then that means there's 10 to 20% tuna in the food. If a particular label says with beef or with chicken or with tuna, that means that particular food has to have at least 3%. So only 3% of beef or chicken or tuna or whatever the descriptive term is. If a product says something like chicken flavor, that means there's probably less than 3% chicken or very little chicken at all in the product. So that is if a product lists a flavor ingredients. This is where companies get really tricky with listing what's in the food. Ingredients has to be listed in the order of weight, in descending order. This means the heaviest ingredients are first. The ingredients list, in my opinion, is one of the least useful information on the bag, and there's 2 reasons why I feel that way. The first trick that companies use is listing moisture-rich ingredients first. Ingredients that are high in moisture are going to weigh more. So for example, if a diet says lamb and rice, the ingredients may look something like this. Lamb, brewer's rice, corn. Lamb in this example is listed first. This is because lamb weighs the most with its moisture-rich content. Companies can use this trick by taking an ingredient such as wheat, which would weigh more than its components. So a company may list something on the bag as wheat germ, wheat meal, and by splitting wheat into its smaller components, it actually weighs less and therefore will appear lower on the ingredient list. It doesn't mean that there's more or less wheat in the product. It's just manipulating the ingredients into smaller weights so that it appears lower down on the list. The feeding directions is the company's way of allowing you to know how much they suggest you feed your pet. And so there's a lot of variation when it comes to this. It doesn't take into consideration your pet's specific needs. So when you're looking at the feeding directions, be sure to understand that it is going to be an individual variation for your particular pet. It's just a place to start. It's not necessarily exactly what you should be feeding your pet at this particular point in its life. The guaranteed analysis is the percentages of certain factors of the diet. The guaranteed analysis can be a little bit tricky. I think we're going to get more into that in part 2 of this series, but the basics is they're percentages of certain legally required defined terms. So on the bag, we must list the minimum for both crude fat and protein, and the maximum for crude fiber and ag. It's important to understand that minimums and maximums aren't specific values. They can be more or less depending on which factor we're looking at. If you want to know exactly how much of a specific nutrient is in a diet, you may have to call the manufacturer to get the exact number. The adequacy statement, or AFCO statement, I think is the most telling and easiest place to look for when you're in a pinch to see if a diet might be good for your pet. It's usually hidden on the smallest portion of the bag. It may be on the sides, or it may be hidden underneath all the other information we've already discussed. This is a legal definition. It must be included on all bags, and this is where 2 of the very most important statements are going to be held. The first thing in the statement is going to be how they substantiate their claim. Is this particular food formulated, or did this particular food go through feeding trials? The second most important thing on this statement is going to be the life stage. Which particular part of life is this food manufactured to substantiate? The first thing I want to talk about is the method used to substantiate the claims of the food. There are 2 ways that you can substantiate the claims for a food. One is to have a food formulated. The second is to undergo feeding trials. If a food is formulated, it means that the food simply was made from a recipe that met all the legal requirements for a diet. So the company took the legal requirements that come from partly from this book of nutrition, and they put all of those requirements in there in order to meet this specific recipe so that the pet food can be legally sold. Companies typically use a formulated substantiation claim because it's least expensive. They don't have to undergo the expenses needed to maintain a proper feeding trial facility. In order to list a feeding trial on your claim of substantiation, you must undergo AFCO standards for feeding trials of a particular food. These are very regulated and specifically outlined protocols in order to properly test a food to see if what is in the diet is actually going to do what it says it's going to do, and to make sure the diet is safe. Foods that have feeding trials are often considered superior to foods that have been formulated. The second part of the AFCO statement is the adequacy statement. This is where it says what particular life stage of the pet the food is meant to feed. The life stages are often listed as all life stages, adult, pregnant or lactating, puppy, and sometimes these particular foods are also listed as not meant for general feeding or not meant for maintenance. These are things like treats or intermittent diets, or diets that are prescription for certain particular needs of the pet. So renal diets or stone dissolution diets, diets that are not meant for long-term feeding. This is where you really need to be looking and really focusing on, because a lot of foods are going to be listed as all life stages. Ideally, you do not want to feed your pet an all life stage diet, because this means it has to meet the most rigorous life stage of all, and that's pregnant and lactating. You want to make sure you pick a diet that is for your pet's specific stage in life. So the AFCO statement should say for maintenance of puppies if you're feeding a puppy food. It should say for maintenance of adults if you're feeding an adult food. All life stages is meant to feed the most rigorous stages in development, and that's often pregnant and lactating. So pets that receive diets that are all life stages are often going to be getting too many calories, because those specific requirements are meant to be meeting the necessities of a pregnant, a lactating, or a growing puppy. The last 2 categories on the bag are the easy ones. That's the calories. So calories are simply how many calories are in the can, or how many calories are there per cup. The thing to remember about this is all foods are different. So just because you fed 1 cup of diet A doesn't mean if you change the diet and go to diet B, you're still going to feed a cup. So you want to make sure that you're looking at the calories and feeding the appropriate calories for your pet. If you need help calculating the calories for your pet, contact your veterinarian, contact us if you're one of our patients, and we'll be happy to tell you how many calories you should be feeding per day. Last requirement is the manufacturer, and that's simply who makes the food and how to contact them. Okay, I think that's enough for today. We'll be getting into part 2 next time. I think that's where we're going to get into the specific breakdown of the nutrients. If you enjoyed this, we hope that you'll like our channel and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.